The forest was still, cloaked in a green tranquility that enveloped Jordan Lewis like a soft, cool balm. Towering trees swayed gently overhead, their leaves casting dappled shadows across the path. Here, surrounded by nature, he felt as if he'd stepped into another world, one far from the pressures and expectations of his fathers. Each step he took felt like a deliberate choice, a footfall echoing his own path, distinct from the rigid life that General Samuel Lewis had envisioned for him. Jordan had come here seeking peace. He had come to escape the heaviness that had settled over him after the last conversation with his father, an argument that had left a bitter taste in his mouth. His father's words replayed in his mind, each one a sharp reminder of their fundamental differences. "Discipline is everything," General Lewis had said, his voice unwavering, every word delivered with the authority of a man who'd built his life on order. "Without it, dreams are illusions. I had dreams too, Jordan, but I learned to let them go. You need to do the same." Jordan had listened, feeling his heart beat with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He understood his father's devotion to a life of service, his belief in honor and sacrifice. But Jordan yearned for something else. He wanted to explore, to question, to uncover the truths buried beneath layers of history and culture. He had dreams too, but they weren't bound by uniforms and salutes. They were bound by curiosity, by a longing to connect with the stories of others. But his father had dismissed his ambitions with a few harsh words. "What you're chasing, Jordan, are fairy tales." Jordan's jaw had clenched. He'd stared at his father across the dining room table, the silence between them vast and suffocating. How could his father, a man who valued integrity and strength, fail to see that pursuing his own path required courage? And so, he had left. He needed air, space to think, anything to clear the resentment growing in his chest. The forest was his refuge, a place where he could find his own rhythm. Here, there were no rules, no legacies to uphold, no expectations weighing him down. For once, he felt free. He moved at his own pace, stopping occasionally to take photos of the scenery, capturing the serene beauty of the wild landscape. Every snap of the camera felt like a small act of defiance, a way of preserving something outside the rigid boundaries of his father's world. He let his mind drift as he hiked further, the canopy above creating a soft, leafy shelter. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs mingling with the faint rustle of leaves. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and soil, a grounding reminder that he was miles away from the tension of home. Here, the world was simple and unjudging, a place where he could let go of the bitterness and find himself again. But as he continued down the narrow trail, something changed. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, a subtle shift in the atmosphere pulling him out of his thoughts. Jordan paused, sensing a presence that hadn't been there before. The quiet was disrupted by the faint sound of crackling branches nearby. His senses sharpened, and he turned, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. It wasn't just the shuffle of an animal. It was too deliberate, too steady. Then he saw them, two figures emerging from behind the trees. Both men wore police uniforms, their expressions unreadable but far from friendly. Jordan felt a ripple of unease pass through him as he straightened, his gaze meeting theirs with a guarded calm. He reminded himself he had done nothing wrong, that he was simply hiking. Still, something about their stance, the way they looked at him, made his heart beat a little faster. One of the officers, a wiry man with narrowed eyes and a sharp jawline, was the first to speak. His badge identified him as Officer Colton. "You're a long way out here, aren't you?" Colton's voice held a hint of condescension as he crossed his arms, his gaze flicking up and down as if assessing Jordan. Jordan took a slow, steady breath. "I'm just hiking," he replied, keeping his voice level. "Taking some pictures. Is there a problem?" The two officers exchanged a glance, a silent message passing between them. Jordan didn't miss the way they looked at him, like he was out of place, an intruder in a world they controlled. The second officer, a bulky man with a perpetual scowl, stepped closer. His badge read Officer Drake. "Got ID on you?" he asked, his voice flat. Jordan hesitated for a fraction of a second. He knew his rights. He knew that he didn't have to show identification without cause. But he also knew the risks of refusing, the danger that could come from asserting those rights. He reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and handing his ID to Colton. who took it with a faint smirk. Jordan Lewis. Colton read, his tone dripping with something that Jordan couldn't quite place but didn't like. You're not from around here, are you? No, Jordan replied, forcing himself to keep calm. I'm just visiting, like I said. Just hiking. Drake echoed his words, dripping with sarcasm. Just hiking, he repeated with a mocking edge, his gaze narrowing as he looked Jordan over. We don't take too kindly to strangers wandering around here, especially those who think they're above the law. A chill settled over Jordan. He felt his throat tighten, his pulse quicken. I haven't done anything wrong, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He could sense the malice in their expressions, the underlying threat that simmered beneath their words. Colton let out a humorless chuckle, his eyes gleaming. Well, that depends, doesn't it? See, people come out here thinking they can do whatever they want. But it doesn't work like that. Out here, the rules are a little different. Jordan's mouth went dry. He could feel the situation spiraling, the once peaceful forest turning hostile. He wanted to speak up, to assert his innocence, but he could see in their eyes that no words would change their minds. Drake cracked his knuckles, his gaze never leaving Jordan. Maybe we need to teach you a lesson in respect, he muttered, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jordan felt his chest tighten as a surge of fear crept over him. He forced himself to stay calm, to think of a way to de-escalate. Look, he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. If you want me to leave, I'll go. I don't want any trouble. But Drake's smile only widened, his tone as cold as his stare. Oh, it's too late for that. Trouble just found you. In an instant, Drake's hand shot out, gripping Jordan's arm with a force that made him wince. Jordan's mind raced, his thoughts scattered as he struggled to keep his composure. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated that a simple hike would turn into a nightmare. But as he looked into the officers' faces, he saw nothing but hostility. And in that moment, surrounded by the forest he had once found solace in, Jordan realized that he was truly alone, caught in the grip of a power he couldn't fight. The grip on Jordan's arm tightened, sending a sharp pulse of pain up his shoulder. He instinctively tried to pull away, but Officer Drake's hand was like a vice, unyielding and powerful. The forest around them felt suddenly claustrophobic, as if the trees themselves were closing in, watching silently as the encounter spiraled into something menacing. Did I do something wrong? Jordan asked, his voice calm but edged with a quiet urgency. He had nothing to hide, nothing to fear, or so he thought. But the looks on the officers' faces told him that his innocence didn't matter. The moment they'd seen him, something had shifted, an assumption settling in their minds that he was here to cause trouble. Wrong, Officer Colton sneered, taking a slow step forward, his eyes flicking with amusement. You think you can just wander out here, like you own the place, and we're supposed to let you go about your business without checking who you are? I'm just hiking, Jordan said, his voice steadier now as he forced himself to stay calm. It's a public trail, isn't it? Drake scoffed, his hand still gripping Jordan's arm, his fingers digging into the muscle. Public or not, people like you don't get to roam around here without us knowing what you're up to. People like me? Jordan repeated, catching the insinuation. He felt a sharp pang of anger beneath his controlled expression, but he swallowed it down. He didn't want to give them any excuse to escalate the situation. But the glint in Drake's eyes told him they didn't need an excuse. They had already decided how this would go. Colton folded his arms, giving Jordan a disdainful look. You got something to hide? What's in the bag? It's just my camera. Some snacks. Water, Jordan replied. You can check if you want. Drake snorted. Oh, we're gonna check, he said, his voice low and threatening. Without waiting for Jordan's permission, Drake released his arm and stepped forward, snatching the backpack from his shoulder. Jordan watched, his heart racing, as the officer roughly unzipped it, sifting through his belongings with little regard for the contents. Drake pulled out the camera, holding it up as if it were evidence of a crime. Taking pictures. Ha! He muttered, a mocking edge to his voice. He held the camera out to Colton, who took it and inspected it with a smirk, flipping through the images with disinterest. Just nature shots, Colton scoffed, scrolling through the photos. What, you think you're some kind of artist? Jordan clenched his jaw but forced himself to stay silent, knowing that any response would only fuel their contempt. They weren't interested in understanding him. They were interested in exerting their power. "Look," Jordan said, his voice calm but firm. "If there's a problem, I'll leave. I don't want any trouble." Drake looked at him, a twisted smile curling on his lips. "Oh, we're past that. See, people like you think they can just come here, do what they want, and leave. But we're here to make sure that doesn't happen." Jordan felt his pulse quicken, a warning in the pit of his stomach that this wasn't going to end well. He glanced around, hoping to see someone else on the trail, anyone who could witness what was happening. But they were alone, surrounded only by the silent trees. "Please, let's not make this something it doesn't have to be," Jordan said, carefully controlling his tone. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm just here to enjoy the forest." Drake chuckled darkly. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, you're trespassing, disturbing the peace." Trespassing? Jordan's heart sank. He hadn't seen any signs, any warnings that this land was restricted. It was open, meant for hiking, like dozens of trails he'd explored before. But he realized now that the truth didn't matter to them. They were going to twist this situation to suit whatever narrative they wanted. "Let's see some respect," Colton said, stepping closer until he was inches from Jordan's face. His voice a low, menacing hiss. "You think you can just walk around here and ignore authority?"
Jordan met Colton's gaze.
His body tense, but he refused to look away. "I've done nothing to disrespect you," he said slowly. "I'm just here. Just here." Drake echoed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you think you're above the law." Jordan's frustration built, a fire simmering beneath his skin. He'd come here for peace, for a moment of solitude away from his troubles. But these men had turned his quiet refuge into a hostile battleground. All because of their prejudices, their assumptions. "Look," he said, his voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "If you're worried about me being here, I'll leave. I don't want this to turn into something it doesn't need to be." But Drake and Colton didn't back down. Instead, Drake grabbed his arm again, his fingers pressing harder than before, his gaze cold and unyielding. "It's too late for that," he said softly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of threat. "You're coming with us." Jordan's heart raced as he realized there was no reasoning with them. Their decision was made, and there was nothing he could say that would make a difference. Before he could react, Colton stepped forward, reaching into his belt and pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The sight of them sent a chill through Jordan. This was no longer just intimidation. They intended to humiliate him, to assert their power in a way he couldn't fight. "You have no right," Jordan began, but Colton cut him off, his voice harsh. "We're the law here. You don't get to decide what we do or don't have the right to do." He sneered, snapping one cuff onto Jordan's wrist. Jordan struggled to keep his composure, his breathing shallow as they clamped the cuffs onto his other wrist, his hands now bound behind his back. He felt his face flush, the weight of the situation settling over him with a crushing finality. He had no control here. They'd taken it all. Drake stepped back, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes as he looked Jordan up and down, assessing the man he'd just reduced to a captive. "You want to wander around our territory like you own it? Well, now you're going to answer for it." Jordan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had come here seeking freedom, a break from the constraints of his father's expectations. But he'd walked straight into a trap set by two men who saw him as nothing more than a target. All he could do now was hold onto his dignity, keep his head up, and refuse to let them see the fear that simmered beneath his calm exterior. "Let's go," Colton said, giving him a shove. Jordan stumbled but regained his balance. His jaw clenched as he steadied himself, with his hands cuffed and his options stripped away. He had no choice but to follow. Jordan's wrists throbbed, the metal of the cuffs digging sharply into his skin with every step. The tightness was unbearable, each painful pulse reminding him of how utterly trapped he was. His hands were bound, his freedom stolen, and every time he tried to pull his wrists slightly apart to relieve the pressure, the cold metal only bit deeper into his skin. The humiliation was raw and heavy, gnawing at him with each reluctant step. "Keep moving," Officer Colton barked, giving Jordan a shove that nearly sent him stumbling to the ground. He caught himself, biting down on a wave of anger and resentment. He knew that any display of defiance would only encourage them to push him further. Their sadistic delight was already evident, and they seemed determined to squeeze every ounce of control from the situation. Jordan focused on his breathing, keeping it steady. As he walked, his mind darted between memories and strategies, anything to anchor him to a sense of calm. He thought of the peaceful moments he'd just experienced in the forest, the chirping of birds and the wind rustling through the leaves. Those memories seemed distant now, replaced by the cruel reality that these officers were dragging him through a nightmare of their own making. They led him off the main trail, deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser, casting long shadows over the rough path. Every step took them farther from any chance of him calling for help, and Jordan felt the weight of isolation closing in on him like a suffocating blanket. The peaceful forest he had once found solace in was now a twisted, sinister landscape, its silence amplifying the heavy thuds of his heart. "Look at you," Colton sneered, glancing back at Jordan with a mocking smirk. "What made you think you could just stroll around here like you own the place?" "I don't think I own anything," Jordan replied, forcing his voice to remain calm and steady. "I was just hiking." Drake chuckled darkly. Oh, he was just hiking. Thought he could take in the sights. Maybe get a few snapshots for his social media. Ha! His mocking tone was drenched in contempt. Colton shook his head. "People like you think you can do whatever you want," he muttered, stopping to turn and face Jordan. His expression twisted with disdain. "Think the rules don't apply to you?" Jordan held his gaze, his voice carefully measured. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not breaking any rules." But Colton's sneer only deepened. "Oh, you're breaking rules all right. And out here, we're the ones who decide what those rules are." He took a step closer, his face inches from Jordan's. "Out here, you answer to us." Jordan's hands clenched involuntarily behind his back, his wrists straining against the cuffs. He had no choice but to stand there, exposed and vulnerable, as they closed in on him. He knew that showing fear would only fuel their aggression, but standing his ground felt like a losing battle. Drake moved in behind him, a low chuckle escaping his lips. "Maybe we need to teach you a lesson," he murmured, his tone carrying a dangerous edge. He reached out, roughly grabbing Jordan by the shoulder and shoving him forward, forcing him to stumble down the path. "Hey, there's no need for this," Jordan protested, trying to keep his balance as he was pushed forward. "I haven't done anything wrong." Colton laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the trees. "Wrong? You think we're going to wait for you to do something wrong? Out here, we don't need a reason." They continued to shove him forward, each step a painful reminder of his helplessness. Jordan's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, but he knew that any attempt to resist would only make things worse. They had him trapped, far from any help, in a place where their power was absolute. Then, without warning, Colton grabbed the back of Jordan's shirt, yanking him to a stop. He pulled a piece of rope from his belt, and Jordan's stomach lurched as he realized what they intended to do. "What are you?" he began, but his voice was cut off as Colton looped the rope around his wrists, tightening it painfully. The coarse fibers bit into his skin, adding another layer of agony to his already aching wrists. Colton secured the other end of the rope to the saddle on his horse, which had been waiting just off the trail, as if they'd planned this all along. Drake mounted his own horse, looking down at Jordan with a twisted smile. "Let's see if you can keep up," he sneered, urging his horse forward. The rope jerked, forcing Jordan to stumble forward to avoid being dragged. "Please," Jordan gasped, his voice strained. "This isn't necessary." "Oh, I think it is," Colton replied smoothly, swinging himself onto his horse. "Maybe this little walk will remind you of where you belong." They started at a slow pace, but it wasn't long before Colton spurred his horse into a brisk trot, forcing Jordan to pick up his pace to keep from being dragged. Every step was a struggle, his legs burning with effort as he tried to keep up. The rope tugged at his wrists, sending sharp, searing pain up his arms with each jolt. Drake rode close behind him, occasionally snapping a whip against the ground, the sharp crack echoing through the trees. Jordan flinched every time, each snap a reminder of the sadistic pleasure they were taking in his suffering. "You wanted to see the forest, didn't you?" Colton called back, his tone mocking. "Well, now you get the full tour." Jordan's breathing grew ragged as he struggled to keep up, his body screaming in protest. Sweat trickled down his face, stinging his eyes, and his throat felt parched and raw. Every muscle in his body ached, his legs trembling with exhaustion. But he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't let them see him fall. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But Drake wasn't content to simply watch him struggle. With a flick of his wrist, he snapped the whip across Jordan's back, the pain searing through him like fire. Jordan stumbled, nearly falling, but he managed to stay on his feet, clenching his jaw to keep from crying out. "Come on, you can do better than that," Drake taunted, delivering another lash. "Pick up the pace." "Boy." The word boy struck a raw nerve, sending a fresh wave of anger surging through Jordan. But he swallowed it down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. He knew that any reaction would only encourage them, would only make his ordeal worse. As they continued down the trail, the forest around him seemed to blur, the once beautiful landscape now a twisted, menacing backdrop to his suffering. The pain was relentless, each step a new form of torture. But he refused to let himself break. He had to hold on, to endure, to survive. Finally, his legs gave out, his body collapsing to the ground in a heap. He gasped for breath, his vision darkening as exhaustion overtook him. But the officers were relentless. Colton dismounted, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him to his feet with a rough shove. "Get up," he growled, his voice filled with contempt. "We're not done with you yet." Jordan barely had the strength to stand, his legs shaking beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright, meeting Colton's gaze with a defiance that hadn't been beaten out of him yet. "Good," Colton sneered. "Let's see if you can keep that attitude all the way back." They dragged him along the path, deeper into the forest, farther from any hope of rescue. Jordan's body was a mass of aching bruises, his wrists raw and bleeding beneath the ropes, his back stinging from the lash marks. He felt his strength slipping away, his vision blurring as his body reached its limits. But even as his body gave in, his spirit remained unbroken. He would survive this, he told himself. He would endure, no matter what they did to him. And somehow, he would find justice. The forest grew darker as they dragged Jordan deeper into its secluded heart, the towering trees casting long, ghostly shadows over the narrow trail. The once welcoming sounds of nature, birds calling, leaves rustling now seemed sinister, amplifying the heavy silence that hung between him and his captors. Each step was a battle against pain and exhaustion, his body aching under the relentless strain. His wrists were raw and bloody, the rope chafing against his skin with every jolt forward. His thoughts drifted to the argument with his father that had driven him here in the first place. He thought of General Samuel Lewis's rigid voice, the sharp disappointment in his eyes, the way he had dismissed Jordan's dreams as meaningless fantasies. How ironic it felt now, that his father's world of structure and authority, which Jordan had tried to escape, was precisely what was trapping him here, making him a captive to men who twisted that authority for cruelty's sake. "Keep moving," Officer Drake snapped, his voice slicing through Jordan's thoughts. He cracked his whip against the ground, and the sharp sound sent a jolt through Jordan's exhausted body. Jordan stumbled forward, his breathing heavy, his muscles trembling. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. His legs felt like lead, every step a Herculean effort. The rope binding his hands behind him dug into his wrists, each tug a fresh stab of pain. He tried to focus on anything else, anything to keep him grounded, the rhythmic sound of his own footsteps, the feel of the earth beneath his feet, the memory of the peaceful forest he had entered hours earlier. But it was nearly impossible. "You think you can just ignore us?" Colton's voice was cold, almost lazy, as he walked beside Jordan, eyeing him with a disdainful sneer. "Look at you, acting all high and mighty. You think you're better than us?" Jordan didn't respond. He knew that anything he said would only fuel their anger. But Colton didn't take kindly to his silence. With a swift, hard shove, he pushed Jordan to the ground, sending him sprawling onto the dirt path. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment, he lay there, dazed, his body screaming in protest. He tried to push himself up, but Colton's boot came down hard on his back, pinning him to the ground. "Stay down," Colton hissed, leaning in close. "You want to know something? People like you don't belong here. Out here, we make the rules." Jordan clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his anger in check. His fingers dug into the dirt beneath him. His face pressed against the cold, damp earth. He wanted to fight back, to resist, but he knew that any show of defiance would only make things worse. Drake dismounted his horse and circled around, watching Jordan with a twisted smile. "Let's make sure he remembers this," he muttered, pulling the whip from his belt. Jordan's heart pounded as he heard the soft hiss of leather cutting through the air. He braced himself, but nothing could prepare him for the sting of the whip lashing across his back. The pain was sharp and immediate, slicing through him like fire. He gasped, his body tensing as he tried to hold back a cry. Drake smirked, taking satisfaction in Jordan's suffering. "Come on," he taunted, his voice dripping with cruelty. "I thought you were tougher than this. Show us that strength of yours." The second lash came down harder than the first, tearing through the fabric of Jordan's shirt and leaving a burning welt across his skin. His teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached, his entire body trembling as he fought to keep silent. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing him break. But as the lashes continued, the pain became too much. His vision blurred, the edges darkening as his strength waned. He felt himself slipping, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. But a spark of defiance kept him grounded. He wouldn't let them see him crumble. "Had enough," Colton sneered, lifting his boot from Jordan's back and grabbing him by the collar, forcing him to his feet. Jordan's legs barely held him, his body swaying as he struggled to stay upright. The forest seemed to spin around him, the trees blurring into a haze of green and brown. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one a battle against the crushing exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. Drake chuckled, clearly pleased with himself as he coiled the whip back into his belt. "Look at him," he said, his voice filled with mockery. "Not so tough now, are you?" Jordan steadied himself, lifting his gaze to meet theirs. His vision was blurred, his face smeared with dirt, but his eyes burned with a quiet defiance that refused to be extinguished. You're not real cops," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Real cops don't treat people like this." Drake's face twisted with rage. "Oh, you think you know what real cops do?" He moved closer, his face inches from Jordan's, his voice low and venomous. "Out here, we're the law, and you're nothing but a trespasser who needs to learn some respect." Jordan's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, but he held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "You're not teaching respect," he said quietly. "You're just afraid." The words hit their mark. Drake's expression darkened, his face twisting with a fury that bordered on unhinged. He grabbed Jordan by the shoulder, jerking him forward with enough force to make him stumble. "Let's see how much respect you have left when we're through with you," Drake hissed, dragging Jordan along the trail, his grip iron-tight. The sun was beginning to set, casting a dim, orange glow over the forest, and Jordan realized with a sinking dread that they were taking him deeper into the woods, farther from any hope of rescue. The silence pressed in around them, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves beneath their feet. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions cold and calculating, and Jordan felt a chill run down his spine. He knew, in the depths of his heart, that they had no intention of letting him walk away from this unscathed. As they marched him down the path, Drake's voice broke the silence, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Think you're better than us, just because you're not wearing a badge?" Jordan didn't respond. His mind was too numb, his body too battered to engage. All he could do was focus on putting one foot in front of the other, on surviving this nightmare. Finally, they reached a small clearing, a patch of dirt surrounded by trees that seemed to close in like silent witnesses. Colton shoved Jordan forward, and he fell to his knees, his strength finally giving out. The officers loomed over him, their shadows stretching long and dark in the fading light. "Here's what's going to happen," Colton said, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to stay here until we decide we're done with you. Maybe we'll even let you find your way back. But first, you're going to learn that people like you don't belong in places like this." Drake smirked, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a flask. He took a swig, then poured some of the liquid over Jordan's head, the cold shock jolting him back to full awareness. Jordan gasped, his skin tingling from the chill as he looked up at them, his vision blurred but his resolve unbroken. He had nothing left to give them, Nothing left to say. He was spent, his body battered and his spirit weary, but he held onto a small, fierce spark of defiance. Drake and Colton exchanged a glance, a silent, cruel understanding passing between them. They had tried to strip him of his dignity, to break him, but they hadn't succeeded. And as Jordan met their gaze, he saw a flicker of frustration in their eyes, a hint that, despite everything, they hadn't completely won. "You're not getting out of here on your own," Colton sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "But don't worry, we'll be back. Maybe." With that, they turned and walked away, leaving Jordan alone in the clearing, bound, bruised, and exhausted. As their footsteps faded into the distance, Jordan sank to the ground, his body too weak to keep fighting. But even in his broken state, he held on to one thought, one promise to himself: he would survive this. He would make it back, somehow, and he would make sure they answered for what they had done. He wouldn't let them strip him of his dignity, no matter how much they tried. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, casting the clearing into darkness, Jordan lay still, gathering the remnants of his strength. The forest around him was silent once more, a peaceful quiet settling over him like a fragile comfort. And there, in the solitude of the woods, Jordan resolved that he would endure. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. Jordan lay on the forest floor, his body aching, his wrists raw and bruised from the unforgiving rope. He felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He couldn't stop replaying the events of the day, the cruelty he'd endured, the humiliation he'd been forced to swallow. His mind churned with anger and frustration, the memory of every taunt, every lash burning into him. The sun had fully set, and the forest around him was now bathed in shadows. Night had fallen, casting a blanket of darkness over everything. Jordan shivered, his body trembling from the chill that crept in with the night air. He was utterly alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. But he knew he couldn't stay here, tied up and abandoned. He had to get back. Somehow, he had to find a way out. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, a distant sound reached his ears, the crunch of footsteps on leaves, the faint murmur of voices. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if it was a blessing or a curse, but he listened carefully, the tension in his body growing with each passing second. Was it Colton and Drake, coming back to finish what they'd started? Or had someone else found him? The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jordan struggled to sit up, his arms stiff and painful as he braced himself against the ground. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting harsh light across his battered form. Jordan squinted, trying to make out the figures approaching. "Jordan!" The voice was deep, commanding, unmistakable. Jordan's breath caught in his throat as he recognized it. General Samuel Lewis stood just a few feet away, his face partially illuminated by the flashlight. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of shock and fury flickering in his eyes as he took in the sight of his son lying there, bound and bruised. Behind him stood Officer Dean, the young cop who had noticed Jordan's name back at the station. Dean looked nervous, glancing between Jordan and the general, his hands twitching with the flashlight. "Jordan," General Lewis repeated, his voice softer now, filled with a hint of concern. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked over Jordan's injuries. The raw wrists, the dirt-streaked face, the torn clothing. Jordan swallowed, his throat dry. He hadn't expected his father to come. After their argument, he'd assumed that General Lewis would remain indifferent, that he'd let Jordan face the consequences of his decisions alone. But now, here he was, staring down at him with an intensity that Jordan hadn't seen before. "Dad?" Jordan's voice was barely a whisper, thick with exhaustion and disbelief. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. General Lewis turned to Officer Dean. "Untie him," he commanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. Dean nodded quickly, stepping forward and pulling out a small knife to cut through the ropes binding Jordan's wrists. As the ropes fell away, Jordan winced, flexing his hands, feeling the blood rush back into his fingers. His wrists were raw, the skin rubbed nearly raw from the constant friction. He tried to move, but his muscles protested, his entire body aching from the ordeal. General Lewis crouched beside him, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. For a moment, his usual stoic expression softened. His eyes filled with something close to regret. "What happened, son?" he asked, his voice low, almost gentle. Jordan took a shaky breath, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. They said I was trespassing," he began, his voice rough from hours of silence. "But it wasn't about that. They didn't care about the law. They just wanted to hurt me." General Lewis's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening as he listened. He rose to his feet, his expression cold and unyielding as he turned back to Officer Dean. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice laced with barely contained fury. Dean shifted uncomfortably, glancing down the darkened trail. "They went back to the station, sir," he said, his voice hesitant. I wasn't sure if I should report it, but when I saw your son's name, I knew I had to say something." General Lewis gave a curt nod, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "You did the right thing, Officer Dean." He turned back to Jordan, his face filled with a determination that was as fierce as it was protective. "I'm taking you home," he said, his voice firm. "But first, I'm going to make sure those men pay for what they did to you." With a gentle but steady grip, he helped Jordan to his feet, supporting him as they made their way down the trail. Jordan leaned against his father, his body weak and unsteady, but his mind clearer than it had been in hours. He felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a lingering bitterness from the fight they'd had. But as he walked beside his father, he felt a fragile connection begin to form, a sliver of understanding that hadn't been there before. They emerged from the forest and reached the edge of the road, where General Lewis's car was parked. He helped Jordan into the passenger seat, his movements careful, almost tender, as he made sure his son was comfortable. Then he got behind the wheel, his face a mask of determination as he started the engine. The drive back to the police station was tense, the silence thick with unspoken words. Jordan glanced over at his father, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to voice. He wanted to ask why he'd come, why he cared after everything they'd said to each other, but he held his tongue, unsure of how his father would respond. When they reached the station, General Lewis parked the car and turned to face Jordan, his gaze intense. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I need to handle this." Jordan nodded, too exhausted to argue. He watched as his father climbed out of the car, his back straight and his shoulders squared as he strode into the station with a commanding presence that made everyone stop and stare. Inside, the station was quiet, the officers casting curious glances as General Lewis made his way to the front desk. Colton and Drake were sitting nearby, their postures relaxed, their faces smug and self-satisfied. They didn't see him coming. "Officers Colton and Drake." General Lewis's voice boomed across the room, sharp and clear, cutting through the quiet hum of the station. Colton and Drake turned, their expressions shifting from arrogance to shock as they recognized him. "General Lewis," Colton stammered, scrambling to his feet. We didn't know you were coming." General Lewis's gaze was steely, his voice cold and controlled. "Explain to me why my son was found bound, bruised, and left in the middle of the forest," he said, his tone deadly calm. Colton opened his mouth, but no words came out. Drake shifted nervously, glancing around the room as if hoping someone would come to his defense. "With all due respect, General," Colton finally managed, his voice shaking slightly, "your son was trespassing. We had reason to believe he was a threat." "A threat?" General Lewis's voice rose, his anger barely contained. "An unarmed hiker, bound and whipped, and you call that a threat?" Drake looked down, his face pale, his confidence evaporating under the general's glare. "Sir, we didn't know he was your son." "That shouldn't matter." General Lewis's voice thundered through the station, silencing every other sound. "Your duty is to protect, not to abuse. You violated everything your badge stands for, and you'll answer for it." A crowd of officers had gathered now, their faces a mixture of shock and unease. General Lewis didn't break his gaze from the two men, his fury unmistakable. "Hand over your badges," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "You're both relieved of duty, effective immediately." Colton and Drake exchanged a panicked glance, realizing the severity of the situation. Slowly, They removed their badges, placing them on the desk with trembling hands. General Lewis took a step back, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Officers will escort you out," he said, his voice filled with finality. "And there will be a full investigation into your conduct." The silence was thick as Colton and Drake were led away, their heads hanging low, their careers crumbling under the weight of their own actions. General Lewis watched them go, his face hard and unyielding. Before turning and walking back outside, he found Jordan waiting by the car, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. General Lewis approached him, his gaze softening slightly as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "They won't hurt you again." Jordan looked at him, the anger and resentment he'd felt toward his father mingling with a newfound respect. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen, truly protected. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Dad." General Lewis gave a small nod, his face softened by a hint of regret. "Let's go home, son." As they drove away from the station, Jordan felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The pain, the humiliation, it was still there, but now it was tempered by the knowledge that his father had come for him, had stood up for him when he needed it most. For the first time, he felt that maybe they could bridge the gap between them, that maybe they could finally understand each other. And as they drove into the night, Jordan felt a glimmer of hope for the future, a future not defined by the scars of the past, but by the strength they had found in each other. As the car rolled away from the police station, a heavy silence settled between Jordan and his father. The quiet wasn't tense or uncomfortable, but rather filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Jordan's body still ached from the day's ordeal, the sharp sting of bruises and raw skin reminding him with each passing moment of what he'd been through. Yet, despite the physical pain, there was a new, unexpected warmth in his chest, a sense of relief and security he hadn't felt in a long time. General Lewis drove with his eyes fixed firmly on the road, his expression unreadable. He had always been a man of few words, someone who believed actions spoke louder than anything he could say. But tonight, after everything that had happened, Jordan found himself hoping for more. He wanted to understand what had driven his father to come for him, to confront the officers and demand justice on his behalf. He wanted to know if this was a fleeting moment of shared understanding or the beginning of a bridge between them. They drove past the city lights, the darkness of the night pressing in around them. And finally, General Lewis pulled the car off onto a quiet stretch of road that led to a small, secluded park. He parked and turned off the engine, letting silence envelop them completely. "Jordan," he began, his voice steady but softer than usual. He turned slightly, his gaze meeting his son's. "I know I've been hard on you, maybe too hard. I thought I was doing what was best, pushing you to follow the same path I did." Jordan looked down, his hands resting on his bruised knees. He didn't respond right away, unsure of what to say. He'd longed to hear these words for years, but now that they were being spoken, he felt a rush of emotions he couldn't easily sort through. "I thought discipline would give you strength," General Lewis continued, his gaze drifting away, almost as if he were speaking more to himself. "I thought that if I showed you how to be strong, you'd be safe. I thought it would protect you." Jordan looked up, his throat tight. "But, Dad, I don't want the same life you have. I respect everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed, but I want something different. I want to explore, to understand people and their stories. I don't want to live by rules that weren't made for me." General Lewis nodded slowly, absorbing his son's words. For the first time, Jordan saw a vulnerability in his father's expression, a glimpse of regret mingled with something close to understanding. "I can see that now," he said, his voice heavy, "and I realize that maybe I was pushing you to be someone you're not." He paused, taking a breath before continuing. "Today, when I saw you like that, in pain, bound, humiliated, it hit me hard. It wasn't just because you're my son. It was because I saw in your eyes something I didn't expect. Strength. Not the kind of strength that comes from discipline or rank, but the kind that comes from knowing who you are, from standing up for yourself even when no one else will." Jordan felt a swell of emotion rise within him, his father's words striking a chord deep within. He had spent so long feeling as if he were in his father's shadow, as if he could never live up to the expectations placed upon him. But here, In the quiet of the night, his father was acknowledging the strength in his difference, in his choice to forge his own path. General Lewis took a steadying breath, his gaze softening as he looked at his son. I realize now that the life I wanted for you was built on my own fears and my own sense of duty, but it's not fair to hold you to that. You're your own person, and you have every right to live a life that's true to who you are. Jordan nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the physical pain he'd endured. I've never wanted to disappoint you, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to lose myself trying to become someone I'm not. The general nodded, a trace of a smile softening his usually stern expression. You didn't disappoint me, Jordan. If anything, you've shown me that strength takes many forms. It's not always about following orders. Sometimes, it's about standing firm in your own beliefs, no matter who might disagree. For a moment, father and son sat in silence, each absorbing the words that had been left unspoken for too long. It was as if a weight had been lifted, the burden of years of misunderstanding slowly dissipating. I'm sorry, General Lewis said finally, the words almost a whisper, for not listening sooner, for not seeing that the world is different now, that you need something different than what I had. Jordan looked at him, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had spent so long hoping his father would understand, that he would accept him for who he was rather than who he wanted him to be. And now, here they were, sharing a moment of honesty that felt as fragile as it was profound. I think we've both learned something, Jordan said softly, his voice steady. Strength doesn't have to look the same for everyone. And maybe that's okay. General Lewis nodded, his face relaxed in a way Jordan had rarely seen. Maybe it is. He reached out, placing a hand on Jordan's shoulder, his grip firm but warm. It was a gesture of acceptance, of understanding, and it carried a promise that Jordan knew his father would keep. They would both try to see each other for who they truly were, without the weight of expectations or the burden of tradition. Finally, General Lewis cleared his throat, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Now, let's get you home. I think we both need a break from everything. Jordan managed to smile, the soreness in his body easing as he felt the warmth of his father's words settle over him. They pulled back onto the road, the quiet hum of the engine soothing in the night. As they drove, Jordan felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would still be moments of disagreement and struggle. But now, for the first time, he felt that he had his father's respect, his acceptance, and perhaps even his support. The city lights grew faint behind them as they entered the countryside, the stars twinkling overhead, vast and open, each one a reminder of the possibilities that lay ahead. Jordan felt a newfound sense of freedom, a feeling that he could truly be himself without fear of rejection or disappointment. And as the road stretched out before them, father and son side by side, he knew they were heading toward a future defined not by expectations but by understanding, resilience, and respect. This, he thought, was what it meant to be family, and for the first time, he felt that they were truly on the same journey, a bond between them that neither distance nor time could ever break. The drive back home was silent but filled with a sense of calm that had been missing for years. As they neared the house, Jordan's exhaustion began to settle in, his body weighed down by the physical toll of his ordeal. The bruises and raw skin served as painful reminders, yet they felt less significant now, overshadowed by the unexpected connection he'd found with his father. The man he had always seen as unyielding and inflexible had, for the first time, met him where he was, on his own terms. When they arrived, General Lewis helped Jordan out of the car, his steady grip once again a source of support. They walked inside together, the familiarity of home wrapping around them in a comforting embrace. Jordan sank into the couch, grateful for the chance to finally rest. But General Lewis didn't sit. Instead, he remained standing, his face set in a look of unwavering determination that Jordan recognized immediately. His father was planning something, the gears in his mind turning with a newfound purpose. Those officers, Colton and Drake, they can't walk away from this, General Lewis said, his voice firm and resolute. What they did goes against every code, every principle that their badges represent. And I'm not going to let them get away with it. Jordan looked up at him, a spark of gratitude and admiration flickering in his eyes. He hadn't expected his father to follow through on his promise of accountability. But seeing his resolve filled Jordan with a sense of justice, a feeling that the ordeal he had endured might lead to something meaningful. "They'll say whatever they have to," Jordan said quietly, his voice tinged with the bitterness of experience. "They'll twist the story, make themselves look like the victims. People like that, they know how to cover their tracks." General Lewis nodded, his expression hardening. "Maybe they do, but they also have superiors, protocols, and a system that's supposed to protect people, not harm them. I've spent my life defending those principles, and I'm not about to let two men with badges throw that away." Jordan felt a warmth spread through him, his respect for his father deepening. He knew the easy path would have been to let the matter rest, to consider the encounter a personal grudge rather than a matter of justice. But his father's insistence on pursuing accountability spoke volumes about the man he truly was. How are we going to do it?" Jordan asked, the hint of a smile forming on his face. General Lewis's gaze sharpened. "Tomorrow, I'll be filing an official complaint with the Internal Affairs Department. I'll also be reaching out to the district attorney. This needs to be more than just a disciplinary action. What they did was criminal, and I'll make sure they face the full weight of the law." Jordan's eyes widened slightly. He knew his father was serious, but he hadn't realized the depth of his commitment. "They're going to try to fight it," he murmured, thinking of the power dynamics that often protected officers like Colton and Drake. "They'll use every resource they have to keep their jobs and avoid charges." General Lewis sat down across from him, leaning forward, his face close to Jordan's. "Let them try. I know the system inside and out, and I know how to make sure that justice is done. This isn't just about you, Jordan. This is about every person who's been hurt, humiliated, or treated unfairly by people who think their authority puts them above the law." There was a fire in his father's eyes, one that Jordan had rarely seen. It wasn't the hard, unyielding force he had come to associate with his father's sense of duty. This was different. It was personal, fueled by a deep need to right the wrongs that had been done, not just for Jordan, but for anyone who had ever been mistreated. Jordan felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for standing up for me, for not letting this go." His father reached out, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice softer now. "This is what family does. We protect each other. And sometimes that means standing up and fighting back when the world goes wrong." They sat together in silence for a moment, the weight of his father's words settling over them. Jordan realized that his father's understanding of protection had shifted. It was no longer just about the rigid discipline and rules that had defined his career. It was about seeing the humanity in his son, recognizing his pain, and doing everything in his power to bring justice to a situation that should have never happened. Finally, General Lewis rose, his resolve still evident in every line of his face. "I need to make some calls," he said, his tone businesslike but with a hint of warmth. "There are people who need to hear about this tonight, so we can start moving forward first thing tomorrow." As his father left the room, Jordan felt a surge of pride. This man, whom he had once thought incapable of understanding his perspective, was now his strongest advocate, committed to ensuring that justice was served. He leaned back, closing his eyes, allowing himself to relax fully for the first time since the ordeal had begun. The aches in his body still throbbed, but they felt less significant now. He was safe, and he knew he was no longer alone in facing the consequences of what had happened. Hours later, when his father returned, his face was a mixture of satisfaction and fatigue. "The wheels are in motion," he said, sinking into the armchair across from Jordan. "I spoke with Internal Affairs. They'll begin the investigation tomorrow morning, and I'll be there to make sure it's thorough. The district attorney has agreed to look into potential criminal charges." Jordan nodded, feeling the relief wash over him. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about standing up to a system that often failed those it was meant to protect. About demanding accountability for the people who had suffered in silence. Do you think they'll actually face consequences?" Jordan asked, his voice quiet. General Lewis's eyes were steady. "Yes," he replied with conviction. "If there's one thing I know, it's that truth has a way of surfacing. They can try to cover it up, but we'll be there every step of the way, making sure they don't succeed." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Jordan's mouth. He had spent so long believing that his father's world of rules and discipline was something he'd never understand, something he could never embrace. But now he saw that justice, integrity, and accountability were principles worth fighting for. Principles that extended beyond any uniform or title. "Maybe I can help," Jordan said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "I can tell them what happened, give them my side of the story. They need to know the truth." General Lewis nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "That's the spirit. We'll both be there. And we'll make sure they hear you." They sat together, side by side, the quiet night settling around them. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, forged not from shared experiences or common paths but from a mutual respect and a shared commitment to justice. For Jordan, it was a new beginning, a chance to step forward with a sense of purpose and strength he hadn't known he possessed. And for General Lewis, it was a moment of awakening, a chance to see his son not as an extension of himself, but as a man with his own values, his own dreams, and his own strength. The rigid expectations he had once clung to felt less important now, replaced by a deep pride in the person Jordan was becoming. As the night wore on, father and son shared stories, memories, and plans for the future. They laughed softly, the tension of the day fading away, replaced by a warmth that neither of them had felt in years. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, they were facing it together, side by side, as equals. When they finally retired for the night, Jordan felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew there was still a long journey ahead, that the battle for justice was just beginning, but he felt ready, grounded by the strength of his father's support and the conviction that his voice, his story, would make a difference. And as he lay in bed, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage, dignity, and the knowledge that he was no longer alone in his fight for justice. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room. Jordan opened his eyes, blinking away the remnants of sleep, his body still sore but his spirit lighter. He had been through a trial that would test anyone's resolve. Yet here he was, stronger and more assured than ever. Today was a new day, one that would bring the first steps toward justice. When he came downstairs, he found his father already at the kitchen table, his coffee cup in hand, his posture straight and focused. The general had been up early, working tirelessly to set things in motion, just as he had promised. Jordan could see the determination etched on his father's face, a look that held no hesitation, only a fierce commitment to making things right. "Morning, son," General Lewis said, looking up with a small nod of acknowledgement. "We're due at the police station in an hour. Internal Affairs wants to start the interviews today. They'll need to hear everything." Jordan nodded, feeling a surge of readiness. The events of yesterday were still fresh, but the presence of his father beside him, unyielding and resolute, gave him strength. "I'm ready, Dad. Whatever they ask, I'll tell them the truth." General Lewis nodded approvingly, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "That's all you need to do. The truth has a way of cutting through everything else." They finished their breakfast quickly, their conversation sparse but charged with purpose. There was no need for further words. They both knew the weight of what lay ahead. As they left the house and climbed into the car, Jordan took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. He was about to confront his accusers, to face the system that had allowed them to act with such cruelty. And this time, he had his father by his side. The drive to the station was silent but steady, each mile bringing them closer to the moment of reckoning. When they arrived, they found a crowd of officers and staff waiting in the lobby, their faces a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and apprehension. News of what had happened to Jordan had spread quickly, and whispers filled the room as father and son made their way to the front desk. An internal affairs officer, a woman with a calm, professional demeanor named Lieutenant Evans, greeted them. She offered a respectful nod to General Lewis before turning her attention to Jordan. "Mr. Lewis, we're ready for your statement. If you'll follow me, we'll go to a private room where we can discuss everything in detail." Jordan nodded, glancing at his father, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I'll be right here, son," General Lewis said, his voice filled with steady assurance. "You're not alone in this." Taking a breath, Jordan followed Lieutenant Evans down a hallway to a small, quiet room, where he sat across from her. She opened a notebook, setting a voice recorder on the table, and gave him a reassuring smile. "Just start from the beginning," she said, her tone gentle. "Take your time." Jordan closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts, then began to recount the events of the previous day. He described the peaceful forest, his hike, and the sudden appearance of Officers Colton and Drake. He relayed the escalating tension, their taunts, the rope, the lashes, and the fear that had gripped him as they dragged him deeper into the woods. He held nothing back, speaking with quiet conviction, his words clear and precise. Lieutenant Evans listened intently, her face unreadable but her eyes filled with focus. She didn't interrupt, allowing Jordan to speak his truth without interruption. When he finished, she nodded, her expression firm. "Thank you, Jordan," she said. "I know that wasn't easy, but you did well. Your statement will be a vital part of this investigation." Jordan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had spoken his truth, laid bare the pain and humiliation he'd endured, and there was a cathartic release in knowing that it was now out in the open. No longer just his burden, it was a matter of record, something that could not be ignored or brushed aside. As he exited the room, he found his father waiting in the hallway, his expression filled with quiet pride. "You did well," General Lewis said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Now, we'll let the system do its part. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that justice isn't always swift. We may have to be patient." Jordan nodded, understanding the gravity of his father's words. The fight was far from over, but they had taken the first, most important step. Together, they returned to the lobby, where Lieutenant Evans was briefing a group of officers on the investigation's next steps. A few moments later, they spotted Officers Colton and Drake, escorted into the building by two senior officers. Both men looked visibly shaken, their earlier smug confidence replaced by nervous glances and tense postures. They avoided eye contact with Jordan and General Lewis, their faces pale as they were led into separate rooms for questioning. Jordan felt a strange mixture of emotions as he watched them. Relief, anger, and, surprisingly, a sense of closure. He didn't want revenge. He didn't even want them to suffer the way he had. All he wanted was accountability, a recognition that what they had done was wrong, and a commitment to preventing it from happening again. General Lewis must have sensed his thoughts because he gave Jordan a quiet, approving nod. "It's not about punishment," he said softly. "It's about justice, and that means making sure they can't do this to anyone else." They spent the next few hours at the station, meeting with the district attorney and other officials to ensure that every detail of the case was documented and that there was a clear path forward. By midday, the preliminary findings were clear. Officers Colton and Drake would be suspended pending further investigation, with charges of misconduct, abuse of authority, and assault likely to follow. As they left the station, Jordan felt a profound sense of relief. The process was only beginning, but he knew that the momentum was on their side. And with his father's support, he was ready to face whatever came next. Once they were back in the car, General Lewis turned to him, his face softened with a rare smile. "I'm proud of you, Jordan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You faced something no one should have to endure, and you stood up for yourself. That takes courage." Jordan looked at his father, feeling a deep, unspoken bond between them. "Thank you, Dad," he replied, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "For believing in me, for standing by me." They drove home in a comfortable silence, the tension of the past few days slowly fading into the background. When they reached the house, they went inside together, both feeling a newfound sense of peace. Later that evening, they sat together in the living room, the quiet hum of the evening settling over them. General Lewis cleared his throat, looking at his son with a contemplative expression. "You know, Jordan," he began slowly, "I spent my whole life believing that strength came from control, from order, but I see now that true strength isn't about authority or discipline. It's about resilience, standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Jordan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He had spent so long feeling like he didn't fit into his father's world, but now he realized they shared a common purpose, one that went beyond titles or ranks. "I think we both learned something," he said softly, his gaze steady. "Strength takes many forms, and sometimes it's about letting go of control." They shared a quiet smile, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. The events of the past few days had tested them both, but they had emerged stronger, bound by a shared commitment to justice, integrity, and respect. As they sat there, the weight of the past lifted, replaced by a sense of renewal. They didn't need words to express what they felt. Their bond had deepened, forged through hardship and resilience. For the first time, Jordan felt truly understood, seen not as an extension of his father's legacy, but as his own person, with his own values and dreams. And for General Lewis, the journey had been one of transformation, a realization that his son's path, though different from his own, was no less valid or worthy. He had found a new respect for Jordan, not just as his son, but as a man who had faced adversity with dignity and courage. As the night wore on, they continued to talk, sharing stories and laughter, the years of misunderstanding slowly fading into the background. Their relationship had been tested, but it had emerged stronger, grounded in a mutual respect that would carry them forward. When they finally retired for the night, Jordan felt a deep sense of peace. The fight for justice would continue, but he was ready, strengthened by his father's support and the knowledge that he was no longer alone. And as he lay in bed, a quiet smile on his face, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage, integrity, and the unwavering support of his father. Together, they were ready for whatever the future might hold, bound by a shared commitment to truth and justice.